Welcome to That Girl Club. We're your hosts, Christina and Katarina, and we're here to empower you on your journey to becoming that girl in every aspect of your life. Join us as we dive deep into inspiring conversations with influential entrepreneurs and experts, sharing their insights and strategies to help you thrive. From navigating the struggles of womanhood to launching your dream business and everything in between, we've got you. So buckle up. You are about to discover what it really means to be that girl. Welcome to the club.
I always like to tell people that therapy isn't necessarily about like feeling better. It's actually about how to feel more difficult emotions better.
Like what to do.
Like how can I be better
so
at being
true.
sad? How can I be better at being anxious?
Yeah,
because again,
you're
like
going to feel these emotions.
You will. Oh, you're
at
a
the
human
end
being.
of the day. You're not going to be like, I'm
Absolutely.
anxiety free. I never have anxiety.
No,
Bullshit.
it's not.
yeah, you should probably get a brain scan if that's the case.
Yeah.
Like there's probably something really bad going on.
We need to study you because there's something wrong, right? Like having triggers, having intrusive thoughts, like it's not that
Just
the
makes
thoughts
you human.
it's not that the thoughts are there, they're going to be there. It's just what you do with it. So,
Yeah, I think that was a really good point on like triggers, because I've heard, people say, okay, triggers are meant to show you where those pain points are, like what you need to work on.
Right.
Yeah. We got to pay attention to them. We can avoid them.
Right. And I think taking it away now from like all the food stuff, but when it comes to trauma or things that you've experienced.
Grief.
Yeah. Trauma's a big buzzword, and like
We can break it down.
I think, and then like healing, like what does healing even mean, or what does that look like? Like what's step one?
Yeah. So that's a big What is
Let's
healing
take a minute
even
with that
mean?
one.
How much time do you have? But yeah, it's a good question. What does healing even mean? I think we have to first know what it is that we need to heal from, and sometimes it's a whole broad spectrum of things. That's why like I'm in therapy. I've been in therapy. I think I'll be in therapy because like there's so much.
100%.
There's so much that I can recognize that I still need to heal from, and it also changes and things continue to happen. And so I don't think we'll ever be at the point where we are just healed individuals. Like there will always be something that we're healing from, I think.
For sure.
But what it kind of looks like is first it's acknowledgement and identifying and being able to say like, okay, this thing happened, right? Like to be able to even acknowledge it or like validate that it was a thing can be really hard for some people sometimes, depending on what we're talking about. If we're talking about grief or trauma, for example. So actualizing it is kind of maybe that first step. Processing it is a huge part of the mix. We're talking about like cognitively, but like feeling wise and body wise processing it as well. That can take a lot of time. And then eventually coming towards some form of acceptance is also really important. So I'm talking like very like grassroots here because I don't know exactly what it is we're working to heal from, right? But I think like it's lifelong healing, right? This isn't a thing that we just get to a point of and we're like, yippee, like I'm totally healed, right?
It's like we're always a work in progress.
Correct.
Kind of thing.
Absolutely.
And it's something to always practice and learn from and all the things.
Absolutely. And, I think trauma, it's kind of one of those things that can happen literally to anybody. And,
big or small too.
No, big or small. Absolutely.
Yeah.
And it's super, super personal. Like, if you experience something and somebody else experienced something, that doesn't necessarily mean that you guys are going to walk away with the same experience. Right.
Sure.
So like there have been studies done on identical twins who've like either, they've had the same parenting or they have gotten into the same car accident and they both walk away with very different experiences. So typically with trauma therapy, we would look at what's known as like the 3 E's. So the event, the experiencing of that event, and then the effects of that event. So more often than not in adulthood, we might notice that we're dysregulated in some way, or we're having really strong intrusive thoughts, or we're feeling some kind of way that we can't necessarily explain. Those would be some of the effects. Or we might notice like a pattern with specific things that trigger us in our environment. And so this is where, in therapy, we would kind of look at that and say, okay, let's like bring this into the conversation around maybe exploring certain memories or how, maybe some parenting could come into play too. A really fun fact about our brain is that about 80% of it develops by the time we're 6 years old.
Wow, I did not know
so
that.
even what we think we don't remember played a huge role in shaping how we react to
and
our reality.
Yeah,
it's wild.
It is.
And you know, the interesting part about that too is I always kind of like to break our brain up into two different segments, like our human brain or our conscious brain, and then our unconscious brain, right? So the unconscious brain is kind of, it's the animal brain, so to speak. It has everything to do with like all of the unconscious functions of being human, versus the human brain is, you know, all of our cognitions, our thoughts, our sense of self, our ability to manage our time. Like I always like to say, like monkeys can't book their own dentist appointments, right? But they can move like us, like they digest their food like us. They can do a lot of like, we have a lot of very similar properties, but you know, they don't necessarily have the human brain that we have.
Right.
So the 80% that gets developed is actually all of those like monkey functions. It's all those unconscious functions, and then the last 20% develops, you know, over the course of, you know, until you're roughly about like, well, 18-ish for women, and then about 25 for boys, give or take.
Oh, we know.
We know.
It's just
ongoing,
the
actually.
research. It's just the research.
It's just research.
Just research.
Not anecdotal at all.
No,
Yeah,
it's just the research. Yeah.
So funny.
Yeah.
Oh my God.
Given that like 80% is formed before we're 6.
Yeah.
Childhood wounds are real.
Oh, it's real.
Oh,
like
yeah, they
if we
are
look
real.
at things from an attachment-based perspective, it's, according to studies, you are likely to develop your attachment style by 3 months old.
Wow.
Right? So like
And it can start as early as in the womb too.
your
interestingly
relationship with your caregiver, your primary caregiver, starts instantaneously. And that's not to put pressure on parents, okay? Like
I was
there's
gonna say, there's probably a lot of moms listening.
there's probably a lot of
Yeah.
that's, we're not instilling panic. It's
No,
more so
of course.
just, you know, there's only so much that we can do. And even when we're looking at this, like the way that we're raised, attachment patterns and styles, like this isn't something that we can't not change, right?
course, yeah.
Nothing's you know, set in stone. I often like to sort of say, like, your responsibility is to grow where you were planted. Like you don't get to decide where you were planted, but it is your responsibility to kind of grow from that. So it doesn't really matter how you were planted or where you were planted, but just what you do with it. So I think that's also important when we're looking at, you know, some of the things.
I always like to say, like, you know, your trauma is not your fault, but your healing is your responsibility.
Yes.
You know what I mean?
Absolutely.
And the cool part about our brain is that it is very, very, very highly adaptable. It's very highly plastic, meaning that it has this capacity to change over time.
Malleable.
Super malleable.
Yeah.
It's incredible. So, you know, when we understand a little bit more about the neuroscience behind that, you know, we can actually take a lot more control over some of these things, you know, and
For any parents listening, like what is something, because obviously I know there's 3 attachment styles, right? It's anxious, avoidant, and secure. Is that?
Yeah, and then there's sort of like a mixed attachment.
Yes. So what can parents do, considering all of this, that, you know, the brain is not developed until, like, that's to me is crazy. What can parents do to mitigate their child being anxious or avoidant?
Very good question. I think the first thing I would think is like, take a breath, relax. Like it's okay. You know, I always like to say to some of my parent clients, like you might mess up your kids in some way, shape or form, and that's totally fine, right? Like you're a human being. This is your first time parenting. So I think my first thing would just be, you know, take a little bit of a step back and you know, just take a couple of really deep breaths, because it's a lot. And it can feel like a lot. You know, a lot of the research points towards the fact that if you can meet about 2 out of 5 of your child's emotional needs, then you're going to raise a pretty secure kid, you know? So I think a lot of that,
like a lot of that anxiety.
Yeah, it really does. It really does. And so you don't have to be perfect. You don't need to necessarily have all of the parenting skills correct or right or anything like that. So, you know, when it comes to meeting our child's like emotional needs, essentially, I always like to kind of give out the mantra, like connecting before correcting, meaning like connect with the emotion before you correct the behavior. Right. So if your kid's having a big tantrum and he ends up like hitting somebody in daycare, right, you would just kind of get on his level and say, oh, buddy, I can see that you're really angry right now. And, you know, really get him to or sort of support him in processing that anger, because children can't necessarily regulate their emotions quite yet, but they can feel them. Right.
Sure.
They certainly can. So if you're able to kind of help them in sort of regulating that emotional experience first, getting him to calm down, doing some deep breaths, giving big hugs, things like that. And then you can sit them down and be like, okay, when we're angry, let's try to do something else other than hitting your friend, because that's not okay. You know what I mean? So following up with correcting the...
I feel like there's a lot of parents today, though, now that are like, because there's a lot of noise around that stuff in parenting. That younger moms will now just be like, "Oh, we don't get mad at our kids now." And
there's a difference between like I think
I
was gonna say people don't really understand what gentle parenting actually means. Okay.
Yeah. It's
gentle
to be like abusing almost.
It's gentle parenting is not just like let them do whatever they want parenting, right? But things that parents can do when they have like newborns or infants or young toddlers, I think Tesia really said, like, you don't have to be a perfect parent. What we do look for in, you know, building a secure attachment style is emotional consistency. So when your parents are inconsistent emotionally, and I'll talk about what that means. Again, we're not looking for perfect, but when they're inconsistent emotionally, the child can develop either a anxious attachment, avoidant, or sort of mixed characteristics. And so when I'm saying a parent wants to be consistent emotionally, that doesn't mean being on all the time. That means even when, you know, you have a newborn child, it means picking key moments in the day when you want to be on and you're consistent in those spurts emotionally with your child, and then check out for a little bit, right? Like be
Take
human,
breaks.
right? Take your breaks.
Because it's like you can't be like this all day
No,
long.
you can't.
It's not
Like,
possible.
it's not possible. You're human yourself, but we are looking for emotional consistency in spurts throughout the day. That can again help, you know, parents help their children build, you know, more of a secure attachment style.
Alyssa, I know you said that you are the couples therapy queen.
Yeah.
So I do want to touch on that, because I feel like in today's world, like relationships, specifically, you know, intimate relationships are a big one, right? Definitely. Like it's hard to have a healthy relationship more than ever, I think, in today's world. And I'm sure, you know, people listening in as well, like have experienced, you know, infidelity maybe at one point or another, right? It could be emotional, it could be physical, but just infidelity, period. Let's say like someone just found out that their partner betrayed them, cheated on them. What would you recommend, like the first thing that person should do?
Yeah. I mean, I guess step one depends on where each person is, right? Has this person emotionally or physically cheated because they want out of the relationship? Is it something, you know, when this person found out they were cheated on, is that something they want to work through? Like, we do have to understand where they both kind of are. Sometimes people don't know either, right? Like, I don't know if I want to stay or go. That's also fair as well. But, you know, I think the first step, and maybe this is a little biased because I am a therapist, but I do recommend that, you know, they seek out couples therapy. Infidelity is such a complex thing to heal in a relationship. And I can talk a little bit more about what we would also do. So I'd always recommend that, you know, they seek out some form of support.
Like together as a couple or individually?
I do believe together as a couple. I do think the person who has been unfaithful in some way would benefit from individual therapy. Simply put, if you're not aware of why, you know, you felt the need to do that, then it could continue to happen. And again, it could be, you know, self-esteem. It could be impulsivity even, not even self-esteem. It could be impulsivity, difficulties with impulse control, you know, things like that. So they
like
have
unmet needs comes up a lot with infidelity too. Like
unmet needs, of course. So they need to understand what is happening for them. So that we can sort of prevent that from happening again, right? So individual therapy is also beneficial. Even individual therapy is beneficial for the person who's been cheated on, because that's so devastating. And I think a lot of people have probably experienced it at some point in time, right? So we all kind of know what that feels like, right? It's just so devastating.
And it's also something that's hard to navigate alone.
Definitely.
Because often the person it's done to will start to internalize, think it's their fault.
Yes.
And I think the reason why couples counseling can be so valuable is that more often than not, because it's so emotionally charged and so emotionally dense, couples just kind of get stuck in this like fighting loop, in this conflict
almost like
loop.
A cycle.
No, literally, that's exactly what it is. So couples counseling kind of helps mediate, first of all of those patterns, and kind of makes, you know, everything aware, and gives the couple the opportunity to kind of like go a little bit deeper without necessarily totally like lashing out, getting defensive, getting critical, or the conversely, like going inwards and getting very like, you know, deeply insecure and kind of lost in some of that too, right? So I think that's why couples counseling can be so powerful, especially in the early stages, because it's like, let's work through some of these big emotions in a way that's a little bit more mediated and a little bit more directed.
Before it becomes like resentment and punishment within the couple. And
it's really hard to navigate without a third party who knows what they're looking for. Again, assuming both partners are in a place where they want to see if they can try to move through that.
For sure. And like rebuild the trust.
You got it.
And it's also valid to not want to do that.
That's
you know,
valid too.
Like and you know, every single relationship is so different. Like this can be a total breaking point for some people. And then for others, it's like, you know what? Maybe I do want to rebuild. Maybe I don't know if I want to rebuild yet. So it's in those stages where couples counseling can be helpful. And, you know, if you don't want to do that and, you know, you want to just kind of call it quits, that's also completely valid. You know what I mean?
Do you think that, like, when you see in your practice, like, do you believe that trust can be rebuilt, like, at that point? Do you think it's possible?
I do think it's possible. I've had some clients who've chosen to separate. I've had some that have chosen to stay together and who really invested in each other, especially the person who did betray their partner. And you can make it work. You can move through and past something like that with a lot of commitment, a lot of consistency, a lot of work. When we look at rebuilding trust, the person who has been unfaithful in some way is the person who needs to take responsibility, take accountability. Oftentimes it does involve very difficult conversations where the person who has been cheated on gets to ask lots of questions so they can understand, so that they feel they know exactly what happened in and out, right? The person who has been unfaithful does have to take a lot of accountability in the sense of working to rebuild that trust. So there's some things that we look at in couples therapy that are like, where the person who's been cheated on can make like low cost requests of their partner or high cost requests. A low cost request, let's say for me, so low cost means like it shouldn't cost you much to do this for me, right? So low cost request for me would be like, well, I need your password to your phone. Right? That might be a low cost request for me. Now for my partner, maybe they'll be like, no, that's a high cost request. But either way, right? Like, so you can make certain requests of your partner to start rebuilding that trust through these sort of requests. Your partner's allowed to make requests of you as well, right? It's not just always a one-sided street.
Right.
But yeah, so it could be, you know, maybe having their location accessible to you on your phone. Over time, we want to sort of see if we can move
away from that. It's a little unhealthy, I feel, to like have that. Like you don't want to have to be doing that.
So it's kind of important at the outset where we work to scale back afterwards. But I think what's most important to understand from this is trust is a choice. It's not something you just build up and there's all these skills and then you're like trusting again. Like trust is a choice that you have to make. So there are things that you can do to try to encourage yourself to get to the point of choosing to trust again, but trust is a choice that you have to make. And so a lot of the work that's done in couples therapy is kind of like a really difficult but beautiful dance of like, can I make that choice to choose to trust you again, right?
That's so well put. I love that.
I do love my work. I do love the work.
So good. It's so good.
Yeah.
And I do like to say that, like, you know, everybody has the capacity to change. Like it absolutely is possible. Change is possible, but change requires a couple of ingredients, right? Like willingness is a big one.
Yeah, they need to
want.
Like
the first
they need
one,
to want to.
Like,
right? They need to want to. It needs to be consistent in some ways, right? Like there needs to be some kind of dedication, some kind of motivation to the to stick with the process. Vulnerability also, and that is something that not a lot of people like to touch. So change, you know, though it is very possible in any case, it definitely requires us to, you know, really look inwards and say, okay, what am I comfortable with versus what am I not comfortable with? And can I be okay with that discomfort? Can I lean into that discomfort, you know, for this outcome for my relationship? You know what I mean?
I liked what Alyssa said on like low versus high cost requests.
Totally.
Because I think even when there isn't trauma or like betrayal within a relationship, do you think that having the same view on how low or high cost a request is within a relationship is what ultimately makes it work? Like to your point, if my low cost request is like check in once a day. But to
They're
the
valid
other
examples
person,
though,
it's like, that's a high cost. Like, it's not going to work. I mean, if my like bare minimum is your like, oh my gosh, high request, right? So not just when it comes to betrayal and whatnot, but do you think
like wants and needs? Yeah. Like what's important from one person to another. I think, you know, so maybe I have a two-parter answer to this. When it comes to infidelity, right, the person who has been cheated on can make low and high cost requests of their partner, irregardless of what, you know, whether their partner agrees or disagrees with whether that's a low or high cost request.
Right.
Now, you know, they can negotiate on those things. It's not just like you cheated, so you do this, right? Like the other person has a say. They have agency. They're their own human, even though they made a mistake. Yeah. But to your point, outside of that, when we look at relationships, like everybody, like we all carry our own life path into a relationship. So we have our own sets of needs, our own wants, things that we're looking for that our partner is obviously not going to always agree upon. So I always talk about how there's no such thing as compromise. It doesn't exist. There is such a thing as negotiation, right? And negotiation isn't always fair. And as long as we remove that concept of fairness from a relationship, you will succeed. Right? If we're looking for compromise, if we're looking for like equality, equal division of things, does not exist in a relationship. So when we're looking at meeting needs, for example, like check in once a day. If your partner's like, oh, that's ridiculous, well, I think I'd have some issues with that. Like, I feel like that's, you know, like that's at the lower, that's at the lower end spectrum of things. But you know what? Like, just for the sake of the argument, right? If checking in once a day was, you know, something that was a little difficult for that partner for whatever reason, say they work like 14 hours and don't have access to their phone, right? Then maybe they're...
Which would be the only reason you're not allowed to check in.
You know, like, whatever the circumstances are. Then again, you look to see if you can negotiate. Right. I always like to say, you know, our needs as individuals are like, we have to understand. And I think I also had to learn this myself in my marriage with my partner, that, you know, I had like very high emotional intimacy needs, right? I'd be like, I want to feel connected to you all the time. I need to feel that connection. And I learned over time that, you know, connection is actually a degree rather than something that is like either I'm connected or I'm not. So I feel like once we move out of like the black and whiteness of our requests of our partners, like either I'm connected to you or I'm not, then again, we're in that negotiable ground where it's like, well, actually, even if we're sitting on the couch together and I don't deem this as connection, I know, like theoretically speaking, I'm still connected to you even though you're here, right? It's just a low degree for me, right?
Today was a little more than yesterday or a little less than yesterday, but we're still connected.
So it's also the way in which we look at the requests that we're making of our partners, right? If we get stuck in the whole like, well, it's only fair and like, you know, it's so little of an right, like then we get stuck on the wrong things.
I guess we fixate sometimes on those little things when it's like,
totally,
as a big picture, are they providing
but you know what
I need, and vice versa, right?
That's on being human though, right? Like that's just being human. Relationships, and I think Tesia would speak to this as well, is one of the biggest things that people come into therapy and talk about. Romantic relationships, parents, friends, colleagues,
your relationship with your
boss,
your relationship with everything ultimately.
Everything. It's relationships.
The difficulty with like a couple relationship, you know, or a relationship with like a romantic partner is that, you know, we're touching on some very, very, very deeply intimate things. You know what I mean? Like it's one thing to have relationships with friends, and those are so valuable and so important. Community, you know, your colleagues and whatnot. Like, you know, the closer you get to somebody, you know, you're entering into the heart space, and that's when we're more likely to, you know, notice some deeper seated needs that may have been unmet in some case. You know what I mean? And you know, when it comes to things like intimacy and trust and vulnerability and all that kind of stuff, like it can get very complex. But the complexity of that also lends itself to like the higher degree of meaning. You know what I mean? And so, you know, though it is, it can be perceived as a lot of work, it is also one of the most worth it things. It's one of the most worth it things to work on, you know? So
because the reward at the end of it.
1000%, like having that secure relationship with somebody and really working hard on building that trust with that person. It's like, it pays for itself in dividends. It has the highest ROI, you know? So when we're talking about some of these things that are very complex and heavy, don't forget that like it's so freaking worth it, you know?
Do you think that to build that trust though, you have to go to therapy, you know, or is like there's other ways that couples can rebuild that trust in their relationship day to day?
Is this on like trust in general or also with
I guess
infidelity?
just trust in general.
Yeah, I don't think you have to go to therapy to rebuild trust. It all depends what it is, right? Like some people will, you know, betray their partner's trust by hiding finances from them, right? Like, or you name it, right?
Could
So
be anything,
it could be anything. So no, you don't need to go to therapy to work to rebuild trust. If you notice that you're stuck in some of the kind of what we call like a negative interaction cycle, or we're getting like stuck in the mud, then maybe there's value in having a third party mediator. But of course, you can work through that without being in therapy.
Yeah, 100%. And I think it depends on like, you know, your level of skills in this relationship. Like, you know, are you doing research? Are you, you know, do you understand yourself? Like,
do you know
like,
how to effectively communicate?
Yeah,
like,
yeah.
you know,
I mean,
things
like,
like
I-
that.
Again, a lot of factors.
Totally. Like, you know, I have a master's degree in psychotherapy and I've been practicing for 7, almost 8 years now. And like, I'm not a great communicator in my relationship. Like, I'm not.
Funny, right? Like,
Oh my God, I'm super self-aware. Yeah. But my
It's true,
husband,
though.
he's super good at communicating. You know what I mean? Like he over communicates in ways, which is great, right? Because I'm like, oh yeah, I guess I didn't think about that.
Yeah.
But you know, it just kind of makes for this really interesting dance. And you know, you can know something, but like, do you actually do it? Like there's a big difference between like self-awareness and self-regulation. Right?
Yeah.
We see a lot like, oh, well, I'm self-aware. That's good,
Yeah,
right?
what are
Like
you doing about it? What are you
like,
doing about it?
No, like the
Yeah.
self-awareness is actually the first piece, and it's very hard, right?
Yeah.
But like once we're self-aware,
Yes.
it's like, okay, well, now we gotta do something about it. So
I find a lot of people are like, they claim self-awareness, but they're like, well, that's just who I am.
yeah,
And that drives me
Hot take.
insane.
All of us were like,
take.
well.
Yeah, it drives me insane because it's like, well, okay, so you're just willing to die on this hill of like, that's who you are. Like, there's no growth here. There's no, like.
So our number one rule is do no harm in this practice and in this profession. And I think that extends to everything that we do, right? So like, you can't hide behind that shield of like, this is just who I am if it is hurting somebody, right? Like there's a big difference between intention and impact. And if that impact is harmful in some capacity, whether it's emotional or physical or, you know, intellectual even, like, it, you know, you got to pay attention to that, right? Like, you know, you can't just hide behind this, like, this is who I am, you know? And, you know, for me, for example, kind of coming back to that example of like, I'm not a great communicator. And sometimes that does cause rifts in our relationship. For me, it's like, I can't just be like, well, I suck at this. It's like, no, like
the end.
no, I got to take accountability for that. And I got to figure out how to do better. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And
Oh my
because,
God,
you know,
that's
my husband deserves somebody who can, you know, ultimately communicate, whether it's like big things or little things. So the more you practice it, the better you get at that, right? And
that was funny. Well, I just don't communicate well, so yeah.
sorry, this is who I am.
But it does. It almost sounds a little like absurd, right? When
Yeah.
you're saying like, oh, well, I'm just not good at that, so I'm just not gonna, right?
Well, especially if loved ones or people are telling you like, this behavior is hurting me.
Yeah.
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 Oh,
If you're
yeah.
not willing to look in the mirror and make the changes, then would that would that be like a narcissist?
Narcissism.
Okay, so
I want to get into this.
so this is
good one.
this
is a
is a
great
hot topic. Okay.
Yeah.
Well,
It's-
nowadays it
I mean-
seems like that because
Yeah.
that's all you hear online. Like everyone's like either like diagnosing someone else or
Oh my God,
self-diagnosing.
Yeah.
Diagnosing
TikTok
your
becomes a
parents.
problem.
That's what I was gonna say.
Yeah,
The
this is where
information
TikTok
that we
becomes a
get
problem.
and the inferences we make as a result of the information that we get is getting sometimes a little out of hand, right? Like there's a huge difference between somebody who maybe struggles with like selfish behaviors or is sometimes actually arrogant or, you know, self-centered versus narcissistic, right?
Yeah. It's like you can have those characteristics in
Totally.
your personality, but it doesn't mean you're a narcissist.
Right.
Is
That's
that
correct.
You
what
can
you
have some of
mean?
the tendencies.
That's
that
correct.
would be
Well, it's the
full
same
blown.
thing when we
Yeah.
talked about ADHD, right? Like you can have a lot of those traits, like, you know, you can have a hard time concentrating and paying attention and whatnot, but that doesn't necessarily mean that you have
Doesn't deem you
ADHD,
ADHD.
right?
It
Like
doesn't.
it's the same thing
Okay.
with narcissism. Like, you know, some people have very narcissistic like behaviors. Some people are quite selfish or egotistical in some capacities and maybe lack empathy, but that doesn't necessarily mean that like you are a narcissist.
Yeah. What makes you someone like a true narcissist then?
Yes. So we are looking for like persistent patterns of something, right? Just like Tesia said, it's not like a little bit here and there. This is persistent. This is consistent. So we're looking for persistent grandiosity, persistent sense of self-importance, this persistent need to be admired by other people, right? We even look for different forms of manipulation. Now, when we talk about that, there could be manipulation in the form of like flattery, right? Or we're trying to get something that we want from other people. Or of course, like gaslighting or, trying to invalidate someone's existence or reality. But we are looking for like that persistent, like consistent pattern of this.
Across all areas.
Across all areas, right?
Like it's not just like
not
work.
like just relationships.
Yeah,
not
just relationships.
It's like all across the board.
Correct. Not just with like one person either. You
Yeah.
can't be like the sweetest person, let's say, to your partner or your family and then be a narcissist at work. Like, no,
Right.
like, it needs to be across.
Yeah.
Now, I think what's interesting is narcissists do a good job of hiding the way that they are in romantic relationships from other people. So sometimes it's not widely seen socially, right? They're very good at sort of, masking some of these things. That also makes it even worse for, let's say, a romantic partner, because we oftentimes see like their sense of self-worth and self-esteem will dwindle very, very quickly, right? When you have someone who's consistently invalidating your feelings and your lived reality, right? It's like chipping away at you over time, right?
Totally.
But we are looking, we are
Yeah.
looking for persistent, consistent behaviors, like again, grandiosity, self-importance, admiration, things like that.
I have a couple of clients in my practice who are healing from narcissistic abuse. So, they manage to get their way out of a relationship, which is huge and can be very hard to do. But then, of course, that comes with, a lot of rebuilding the sense of self, rebuilding the ability to trust yourself,
Trust your emotions,
trust your
thoughts.
like trust your own reality, because that abuse can seep very deep into the psyche.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So that's like a whole process, I feel.
Oh, it totally
It is.
Yeah, it really is.
It chips away at your identity as a person, right? So you have to actually rebuild that, trusting in your feelings, trusting in your thoughts, trusting in your wants and needs, right? That I'm a person who's allowed to feel this way, or I'm a person who's allowed to have these needs, right? Or these feelings. So
and that can take a long time too. It's not just like you got a couple of therapy sessions and you're good to go. Like it can be, a couple of years. It can be in like, I think trauma that happens in relationships more often than not is healed in relationships too. Right. So, finding a lot of healing through love. Like I know there's that typical trope of like, if you can't love yourself, how can you love somebody else?
Yeah.
But, healing, sometimes it happens because of love.
Yeah. Like when that trauma stems from how someone treats you, you may need to just see a different way of being treated to understand like,
Totally.
oh, wait, it wasn't me.
Yeah.
So I think there's a lot there, right? Like we could unpack this.
We could do a part 2 on just narcissists.
On just narcissism, right? Like,
okay, well, we are so glad that you guys were able to come on today.
it's been so fun.
Yeah, thank you so much for having us.
It's been such a good conversation.
I know,
Like,
and I just can't wait for everyone to listen in and like hear all the things and learn. And I feel like we've learned so much from you guys already. So I'm just so excited. Before we close things off, we do want to ask you guys one sort of final question that we ask all of our guests that come on the show. What is one non-negotiable tip or practice that you feel really makes you that girl?
Yeah. I think I'm that girl when I'm checking in with myself often, like constantly checking in with myself. I do have a really strong inner monologue and like dialogue, so that's easy for me. But I can also like get carried away in my own dialogue. That means that I'm not checking in with myself. So checking in with myself all the time probably makes me regulated and that girl. So
I love that. I need to do that more.
Yeah, we do.
I think the ways in which I feel the most like that girl is when I can acknowledge and also be okay and accept discomfort. Right. And just, recognize that as a very normal part of the human existence and a normal part of growth, normal part of accountability and vulnerability and all those kinds of things. So, lean into that discomfort. It's not bad. It's actually very, very, very good to recognize it. Own your shit.
I love that.
Own your shit.
Oh, and also
Use it.
sleep. Get
Period.
some sleep. Sleep, bitch. Yeah.
And 7 to 8 hours a day, maybe more.
Hard sleep boundaries. Sleep
8
is a
plus.
non-negotiable, because when
8
you
plus.
sleep well, you live well.
Well, for our
That is so
female, listeners, women need more sleep than men. Don't follow your partner's
Thank you.
sleeping
Do
pattern.
not.
No,
Don't
go to bed
do
at a
it.
different time,
Agreed.
girlies.
I hate when he's like, just wake up a little earlier in the morning. I'm like, babe,
No.
I don't function the same as you. It's not the same. I need more sleep physically.
All
Get
the
your
sleep
sleep.
studies were done on men anyway when they
No, literally.
decided it was 7-8 hours. We need more.
We
we
do
do need
actually.
more.
It's
We do need
starting
more.
to be proven that women need anywhere from 8.5 to 9 or sometimes 10 hours
Wow.
of sleep a night.
Okay, amen to that.
Amen to that.
So sleep, bitch.
Sleep.
You better sleep,
I
bitch.
love that. Okay, ladies, so where can our listeners find you, book a session with you?
So we are the Shine Mental Health Collective. My name is Tesia, and this is Alyssa. We can be found at shinementalhealthco.com, and our Instagram page is shine.mh.collective. We're really, really, really good therapists, but social media is marketing. We're working on it.
Just Google us.
Just
Shine
Google us.
Mental
Yeah,
Health
yeah, we're on
Collective.
Google.
You'll find us.
Google Maps. We got 3
Yeah.
locations. We have a growing team of upwards of 20 therapists currently that we work with, and I can
Students
attest to
as well.
students.
Interns, clinical placements for pro bono sliding scale therapy as well. So
That's amazing.
And it's so fun. We love it.
We love
and
it.
we can attest to every single one of our team members. Anybody who has all the ones that we're working with, they're all fantastic, in their own ways. So, whether it's, you're struggling with your relationships, work, this, that, and the other, there's a really good chance that we have a therapist on our team that treats that. So reach out.
I love that.
Thank you, ladies.
Thank you.
thank you. Yay!
Thanks so much for joining us. We hope you enjoyed today's episode. If you did, we'd really appreciate if you could rate, and subscribe on YouTube, Spotify, and Apple Podcasts.
Don't forget to follow us on Instagram and TikTok at It's That Girl Club to stay in the loop with your girls and join us in becoming that girl. See you next Wednesday.